Hey, welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you are a returning subscriber, hey, bestie, hope you're having an amazing day. You see what happens when you subscribe. You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. On this episode, we talked to Curtis Oltmans. He is a chief legal officer, has built several compliance programs, and he has a really cool framework of how to kind of communicate the ethical advice versus the legal advice within the organization to build better trust. So hope you enjoyed the episode. It's really phenomenal. I learned a lot.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Kurt.
Hi, good afternoon.
How's it going, buddy?
Very well. How are you?
Good to see you.
See you.
So been excited to get you on. Our pre-show was so interesting and just love your energy and love your angle. So I'd love to dive right in here.
Do that.
So what inspired you to pursue this career in compliance? And you're somebody who's very passionate about it, but you've been in this space for a while. What keeps you so energized and keeps you so passionate about the space we're in?
Yeah, absolutely. A great place to start. Pleasure to be with you today. I truly believe that running a business in an ethical way can be an advantage. I really do think it can be a competitive advantage. I do think it's valued. Obviously, not everyone agrees with that statement, but I think a lot do. And doing things the right way and demonstrating to customers and your community broadly that you're a company that wants to operate with ethical principles that mean something. They're more than just words on a page. Yeah. I really do think can be very powerful.
So where were you in your journey? Because at some point you were a little kid. If you were like me, you wanted to play baseball or basketball or something. And then now you find yourself here. And so there was a whole journey that took you into this industry. Talk to me a little bit about that journey and talk to me about when you had that light bulb moment, around what you just said, that, doing things the right way is not just good for the sake of it, but also it leads to better results,
Yeah, I don't know if there was one catalyst moment, but I've spent my whole career really in healthcare. And I think early on in healthcare, I was exposed to lots of ethical questions, right? Doing research on both animals and human beings raises all kinds of interesting questions. At what point do the safety issues, outweigh going forward? Are we being sufficiently transparent with the physicians and the patients in the clinical trials, et cetera, as well as treating animals humanely? And I was just really intrigued with, you just cannot conduct research in this space and not have to face those issues on a day-to-day basis. So I think that was kind of my first introduction. And at that point, I was at Eli Lilly and Company facing a lot of those questions. Great opportunity for a young lawyer to be, jumping into that, trying to give legal, but also, business and compliance advice as well of, how do we do the right thing while trying to advance science and, make treatments available to patients where sometimes treatments are simply unavailable.
So take me back to law school. Law school is such an interesting thing. At least that's what I hear. Everyone sort of comes in and you're like, yeah, I want to be a lawyer. And then you start to see like, oh, there's 1,000 different types of lawyer I can be. I can do this or I can do that. It's always so interesting to hear people's process through that. What caused you to take the exit ramp that you took? What was it about Eli Lilly? Did you work there right out of school?
I went to a law firm first. So I was at a large law firm first, but representing pharmaceutical companies, medical doctors in different types of things. I was always interested, even in law school, in that intersection between medicine, science, and law, where ethics and compliance obviously are part of that equation. And that appealed to me even in law school. You're exactly right. There's 1,000 different specialties, just like doctors, that lawyers can become. I went into law school not really knowing exactly what I wanted to do. And I always just were, both in law school and then after law school, really intrigued again by all the really challenging but really interesting ethical dilemmas and questions and compliance issues that one has to wrestle with in the context of healthcare and both treating physicians as well as conducting clinical trials involving human beings.
So if you think back to that first job out of law school at that law firm, Were there any moments that were like really surprising or really defining for you? Where like, you kind of thought it was going to be one way and it ended up being another way. I'll share a quick story while you're thinking. I grew up in a small business and I was, first one in my family to go to college, and it was so exciting to read these case studies because it's like I kind of understood business a little bit, but I was like, okay, this is cool. This is how like the big boys do business. And I was always so excited, when I was in undergrad to like get into the real world and be a professional and see how, see these big companies in action. And so my first job out of school was at KPMG, and I was doing transaction advisory work. So we were going into these big companies, and man, I remember having this like light bulb moment where I was like, I thought our small business was like messy, and I was like, this thing is way more messy than I thought. Like I just had this like naive view that like, in a small business, the small family business that I grew up in, we were just kind of trying to figure stuff out. But I just thought like, well, look, there's all these MBAs running these massive companies whose logos I know and see commercials for. It must be so different. And like when I stepped into it, it was way closer to what I grew up in versus the kind of like idealized picture in the case studies that like you learn in class. So that was a big eye opener for me because I was just like, okay, well, I learned to play on a little sort of travel chessboard, and this is one of those big chessboards that you see at a resort, but it's the same game. It's the same kind of challenges, the same, process adherence is always an issue. You know what I'm saying? Like, so that was a big light bulb moment. Was there anything like that where you kind of thought it would be one way and you got into it and it ended up being a little bit different or a little more realistic?
Yeah, no, and thank you for the time for this story to come back to me. As a very young lawyer working for a large healthcare company, we're working through a very serious issue, potential for human harm in clinical trials or people had been injured, et cetera. A little unclear what the situation was. And it was one of the first times I remember, giving advice to a general counsel of a large company. Business leaders were there. The CEO may even have been involved in this meeting. And I very much gave, advice that everyone agreed from a legal perspective. But it was interesting. It was either the CEO or the general counsel who, sat back and said, okay, that all makes sense. I understand your legal advice. Now I want to pause and talk about what's the right thing to do. Is the legal answer the same? Because it may or may not be. And I'd never really thought about it that way, even coming out of law school. But being a young lawyer, we're giving legal advice. And of course, we want to help companies, achieve their goals and get there doing it, hopefully how people outside would view it as doing it the right way. But I was just so struck. And perhaps that was a catalyst moment for me that I reflect on this now, that the CEO sincerely took on board the legal risk and the advice of how to deal with this risk, how to mitigate it, but wanted to know, from the patient and the community and the treating physicians involved in the situation, is that going to be viewed as the right thing to do? Because we have this bigger overriding obligation to the broader community and to patients and to others and the human beings involved that may or may not be completely aligned with what the legal advice was. And then we just had a really interesting discussion. And on this occasion, there was a slight deviation from, the legal advice because of that, need to do the right thing, do things in a compliant way that, you could be proud of. The CEO said, I may have to explain to the general public someday what I did in this moment. And I'm not entirely comfortable with where the legal advice would take me. I want to take it in a slightly different direction because then I can feel proud of what we did. And then we did the right thing in my view, that I think I can convince people that we did the best we could in this really difficult situation.
So what message did that send you? It obviously showed you that there was a different or like an additional dimension to the advice or an additional kind of, there's additional dimensionality or additional sort of like depth to the decision. But what message did that send? Because I just think that's interesting because perhaps a different CEO in that room wouldn't have had this sort of impactful moment with you,
Yeah. No, I think it carried through with my career after that again, doing, making hard decisions, that companies and leaders have to that face all the time, doing something that you can explain publicly to your family members and others and be proud of it, is a part of the equation that needs to be included. So that probably was my first interest in how compliance can really help, businesses be successful and make perhaps better decisions, or at least decisions that are easier to defend to your shareholders, to the general public, and other key stakeholders. And that is something that hadn't, was there, I guess, in my law school training, but it hadn't really crystallized until that moment. So that probably was the moment that I realized that the right thing to do, the ethical thing to do, has to be part of the decision making, of these types of situations in really in a explicit way. It has to be on the table. And again, businesses every day wrestle with those types of dilemmas.
Not sure if you, I'm not sure how much interaction you had with other people in that organization, but did you get the sense that, that CEO was not the outlier in the room, but that message was kind of resonant with the other kind of decision makers that were receiving your advice?
I did. And I do think that those were the cultural values of that organization, instilled by that CEO. No one in the room, I was a little bit surprised, as I shared, that the CEO wanted to go there next with the conversation. But the other business leaders, certainly the General Counsel, we even discussed it later, it didn't surprise them. So I do think it was both the values of the CEO, but also those values being reflected across the organization. So, I mean, I think a great example of, and they, I'd seen their code of conduct and I had some sense of the organization, but you don't really know until you have one of these hard conversations. Again, your code of conduct says X. Now we're faced with a really difficult decision. Does that code of conduct apply, or are we going to bend the rules? Are we going to, try and spin and pretend that we don't have to go there? And this particular CEO on this occasion walked right into it and said, no, we're absolutely not going to duck that. We're going to go there so that if I do, in fact, have to explain this, and in fact, the company did have to justify what they did in that moment in terms of decision later, it played out in the public domain. That CEO was correct. And then he felt like he was in a much better position to, justify the decision.
It's so interesting. Like, the tone from the top thing is such like a performative element. Like it's like if you're a home run hitter, well, then you prove that when you're in the batter's box and that pitch comes across the plate. It's like the reputation, the brand, the true sort of like manifestation of the culture. It comes out, to your point, in those tough conversations or in those tough moments where you have to make that trade-off. And I think it was cool. I'm sure. I mean, it's clearly like impactful and a memorable moment, but there are hundreds of those moments that, employees see their leaders, whether it's their local kind of team leader or the broader sort of leader of the organization. They're taking in all that data because there's all these different pitches across the plate all the time. And it's just that sort of like sum total amalgamation of all these different impressions that end up actually influencing the behavior. It's a really, on the one hand, it's like it's this sort of amorphous thing that's hard to wrap our hands around. It's like ethereal or something. But on the other hand, there's a certain tangibility to it because everyone kind of sees the same game. Everybody sees the same performance, and that, it's like you're a participant in the system that you're a part of. And that study where like I'm going to botch this because I'm not a scientist, but like they would like the electrons behave differently if you're viewing them. Like us just merely viewing something is affecting like how those kind of elements are behaving. How much more so as leaders, or how much more so as ethics, compliance, legal folks who are helping to like shape the direction of that culture? How much more, influence and like input do we end up having on what that ultimate outcome is,
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So you moved from the law firm into Eli Lilly. I'd love to hear about that experience. And I'm just kind of curious, what is that clinical trial game like? Is it like, you're throwing out a bunch of seeds and only one of them turns into a tree? That's kind of what I think, that's my like, naive impression of it. Is that kind of what it's like? You're trying all these things and, 1 out of 100 are going to, pop and become like a valid drug?
To some extent, yeah, and it obviously varies, and I'll generalize. And in more of my, in fairness, more of my early development, what we'll call clinical trial support of companies, is more recent in smaller biotech. So I'll probably use that as more of a reference. I had different roles at Eli Lilly, although it was probably similar. There's a lot of work that's done in the laboratory, and it's certainly increasingly today, even using artificial intelligence and machine learning to try and narrow down, Nick, what you mentioned. How do you narrow down? There might be 100 compounds that might do whatever problem we're trying to solve to treat that patient ultimately. So there's a lot of work done in the lab. There's now a lot of work done using AI and machine learning that I'm not an expert on, but that's really intriguing. I think that's going to unlock a lot of capabilities. And then next you go into animals to see, do you see some type of effect in animals? Are there any safety things you need to look for? Something that the industry is trying very hard. We try and use as few animals as possible, and try and extrapolate what would happen for obvious reasons, because these animals all have to be sacrificed at the end of the animal study that's determined. And only then do we go into, and typically into a small number of healthy volunteers that don't even have the condition that you're trying to treat, to make sure there isn't something unexpected, because candidly, when it's a brand new compound, you don't know exactly how the human biology, and you have ideas, but you're not 100% sure what that's going to look like. And then ultimately you find your way in a very small number of patients. You go very slowly trying to find the right dose, et cetera. So you can get a sense for all of that. There's a lot that happens before a human being ever takes any kind of treatment, whether it's a pill, a tablet, gene therapy, doesn't matter, that we do as much as we can before we ever are conducting an experiment on humans. And I just want to take a moment and shout out, the fantastic people that are both volunteer to be in a trial, whether they have the condition or not, to help advance science. And there always is risk. And we're very transparent with people that there may be no benefit to you being in this trial. It may not work. It may, in fact, harm you. And you are part of a scientific experiment. So, when the COVID vaccine was being developed, for example, thousands of people had to volunteer in order that we, could study that. So that kind of gives you a sense. It's very expensive and a long process to do the clinical trials. So, a lot of it happens before we get to human beings. And then you might have a couple of compounds you're testing, but you certainly don't do large numbers for all the reasons I've just described. Both how long it takes, how expensive it is, and candidly, you want to eliminate it as much as possible because of the risk to the human beings in the trial.
So thanks for that. That's got to be it's such an interesting ecosystem. You know what I'm saying? You have these voluntary participants, and there's animals involved, and there's machine learning on the front end to make sure that you're minimizing the risk and so forth. And I just have this, picture in my mind of, you're just throwing all these acorns out, and they're not all going to turn into a copse of trees, but like some of them will. And there's like a corollary in finance. This might be stupid, but just bear with me here. In venture capital, it's a kind of a similar thing, I think, where you make 100 investments across all these, VC companies, these VC-backed companies, and 98 of them are going to, turn out to be a zero, but your fingers are crossed that you're going to get the Uber, or you're going to get the Facebook or something like that. That's going to make the whole fund, generate the return that you want, right?
Yes.
So inherently and stereotypically, venture capital investors have a much higher risk tolerance because they're just kind of throwing chips around. This is a caricature what I'm sharing, but they're throwing chips around. They're not doing a deep dive, full kind of proctology exam on the company before they make the investment. They're looking at the idea and so forth. And so in that environment, that risk tolerance is a lot higher. And they're making sort of broader bets, and they're kind of counting on, one of those to be a home run. In the context of the clinical trials, there's obviously some corollaries, but I'd like to dive into the cultural implications for that kind of a business dynamic, because it's super critical that if one of those acorns turns into a tree, that all those boxes are checked along the way, that process was adhered to perfectly, right? You have to keep your eye on the ball. You can't be loosey-goosey with it. Although, on the one hand, you can't be loosey-goosey with it because it might turn into a tree, like I said. But on the other hand, in the back of their mind or in the subconscious, everybody knows that like the odds of it turning into a tree is very low. So how do you help via the program or via like influence throughout the organization? How do you not how do you prevent folks who are participants in these trials from like falling into that, what I'll kind of shorthand term, like that VC mindset where we care a little bit less, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you mentioned earlier, the importance of being disciplined in your process of how you go through it. And we have to be extremely diligent. And there's a huge amount of regulations, as there should be, and process and international ethical standards that we have to apply. And I'll use one small example, and where I spend a lot of time in our organization. It might sound simple to create an informed consent that these volunteers in these trials complete and go through, but it's really challenging because that's where we disclose the potential risks, and you have to do it. Obviously, these are not people typically with medical training. So it's very difficult to strike a good balance in terms of being transparent, but putting it in language that they can understand. And there are even FDA standards of, what level of education we have to aim for to put that into the informed consent. And then we update it. If something, even during the trial, one patient has extreme headache or whatever, and we think it might be tied to the compound, you have to go back and change the informed consent under some circumstances, go back and notify all the physicians who are administering and say, hey, we're not entirely sure, but look out, monitor, and warn the patients that they need to be on call for very severe headaches, because we're not sure, but it could be. So again, there has to be really a lot of rigor, and all these trials have to be conducted exactly the same way. Incredible amount. It's impossible for me in this conversation to describe how complex it is and how it has to be. And you have ethical review boards that have to look at, the design of the trial, and they review very carefully our informed consent. And these are physicians and safety experts to make sure they agree that based on the known amount of knowledge about this experimental compound that's not approved by any regulatory agency, that what we have in the informed consent is a fair amount of detail so that this patient, talking to the doctor in front of them, can make a duly informed decision about whether or not they want to participate in this trial. And, that sounds simple. And I can tell you it is very, very challenging. Because if you disclose too much and you confuse or scare the patients in a way that's not constructive and the doctors can't explain, that's not helpful. But on the other hand, you can't limit or downplay, the known side effects. You have to find this middle ground so that physician and patient can have a really transparent and open discussion. So that's just one example. And again, it's not just us, but these independent review boards at institutions where the clinical trial will take place, they also independently look at it. They have to sign off as well. And they can and do impose changes or say, no, you can't run your trial this way, or you have to do something different, or we want additional lab work done at these intervals. All that back and forth is happening again to try and do our best to make sure that patient who's volunteered to be in this trial is being, we're doing it the right way, doing it the best we can, but we cannot eliminate the risk. We can't. So the people that are in these trials, they're truly great citizens. They're helping us advance science, but they are taking risk. There's no way around it.
And they're putting it in arguably their greatest asset, their own body. I mean, it's
correct.
But that little picture, I mean, it's like, I don't know how the sausage is made clearly, but that little picture indicates the monstrous complexity of something like this and the importance, to your point, of every step along the way, because one foot fault could probably ruin the whole trial. So it's super critical, that each one of those steps, and man, oh man. Do you find that so it's obvious compliance is obviously very critical in this industry, in these businesses, right? That sort of compliance overhang kind of, everyone's affected by it because it's highly regulated and so forth. Do you feel like it's easier or harder, and maybe this is a stupid question, but do you feel like it's easier or harder to get the behaviors or to generate or influence the behaviors that are necessary in this highly regulated environment where everyone knows that compliance matters and this regulatory overhang is real? Is that easier than a less regulated industry? And maybe incorporate in your answer how that added complexity kind of perhaps counterbalances that?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. It is my sense. I have most of my career I've spent in the highly, highly regulated healthcare space. And I do think it makes my job easier when, people will come to me with compliance questions even before I proactively spot issues. Sometimes they know they need to ask. We know there are ethical compliance issues here. We need some advice. We're not quite sure. So I think, for the most part, people I've had the privilege to interact with all across healthcare, large pharma, small pharma, doctors' offices, et cetera. For the most part, people are very much leaning in, wanting to do it the right way, because again, you can endanger patients, you can endanger the very trial, you could potentially endanger the existence of a company because the stakes are so high. People, I think, are less likely, to want to do that. Whereas early in my career, I, was involved in advising insurance agencies and car dealers and even others where, they're far less, they're still regulated, but far less. And harm to human beings is less likely going to be the outcome if you get it wrong. And I do think it's not as top of mind. And sometimes people were a little bit surprised when, I raised, well, are you sure this is the right thing to do? I mean, here's my legal advice, but, let's think through this from a reputational standpoint. If you do X and then it plays out in the media, are you going to be happy and able to defend why you did that or didn't do that? And those were sometimes harder discussions because, again, they didn't assume that the risk of some type of regulatory oversight or even the media getting interested was as high as it clearly is in healthcare.
Yeah, and I think that's part of your job to be as a trusted advisor to somebody, whether it's leadership, business, whatever, is to help them see around the curve and, ask them those tough questions because everyone's running so hard. Everyone's running fast. Everyone's, doing their best. Those are tough questions and they're critical.
Yeah, to your point, Nick, I've been pretty lucky, at least in my career. I really have run into, I would say, a very small number of people who are actively trying to avoid, the ethical rules of compliance. I really seen very little of that. It's much more what you just said. The business world moves at the speed of sound. We have to be running faster than our competitors. We can't slow down to really contemplate all the potential consequences if we take this action or if we don't take this action. It's much more of that. People not pausing, slowing down, analyzing, planning enough, being proactive, and contemplating things as opposed to, well, we know there's a speed limit. We don't care. We're going to go twice the speed limit. And if we, crash the business, we're not going to worry about that. It's not that kind of intentional. It's more we're in a big hurry, and the competitor's we know they're going to launch next week. We have to launch earlier. We don't really have time to sit and think through all the implications. We have to do it. It's that's what the business needs. It's been much more of that. But again, I've really had a great pleasure or maybe just luck in the people I've been able to give advice to when I've raised these kind of issues, really, force people to think through the potential consequences. The vast majority of the time, people will pause and take the time and really want to wrestle with and come to, what is the right thing to do as measured by an objective observer outside the business, which I often use, what would this look like in the media? What would this look like to a family member? Are these things that you'd be comfortable explaining? Because if not, we really need to pause and think because in today's world, there's every possibility it will play out in the public domain.
Yeah, and that cost. I mean, to your point, most of these mistakes are, mistakes of ignorance. I would say there's not like an intentionality in most of these cases. Do you feel like those interactions where you've had to ask those tough questions and sort of, let's just say for shorthand, balance the legal versus the kind of ethical consideration? Do you feel like the overwhelming response that you seem to have gotten, does that allow you or does that cause you to kind of assume more positive intent with just the general, employee base who you are kind of at a high level trying to influence?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and slightly in a different angle to your question, Nick, is, a question that certainly does come up is, we have a competitive landscape in the US and in most of the world. It's very competitive. And so an element that will come up is, particularly if you're advising that, ethically, we probably should not do this. And a common response to that we have to is that, well, our key competitor is doing exactly that. And it may not be, it may be in the gray zone. It may not be entirely legal and or compliant, but we have to compete with them. And we're a public company. We have shareholders to answer for. How do we reconcile that? And that comes up frequently. And that is very challenging, particularly in a highly regulated industry where the rules apply to all. But of course, like many things in life, they're certainly gray. It's not always black and white. And different companies interpret the same regulations differently. So, that certainly comes up, and that is something you have to wrestle with. But again, I think people, not that that's the be all end all, but people want to know that, but they still then want to step back and say, okay, but assuming competitor, we agree, we have direct evidence, they're doing exactly what we're trying to sort out whether we should or shouldn't do. We still want to wrestle with it and understand, do we feel good about doing that? Can we defend it? Because if a regulator or the media or a key stakeholder asks us, why are you doing that? Pointing to a competitor doing it, that's not a good answer, right? No. I don't care what they're doing. I'm asking you. Why are you doing that? And how can you defend that? Are you sure that that is ethically, and are you doing it in a compliant way? We have to be able to answer that question. So while it's interesting to look at it through the lens of the competitor, that doesn't really help with your employees and your key stakeholders if we're the ones that have to defend that behavior. If you're just part of a herd everyone's doing something they shouldn't be doing. That, in my view, is not the right way to look at it. But candidly, in the business world, obviously, we can't ignore competitors. We have to pay attention to what they're doing, and we have to wrestle with it. And sometimes I've been involved in decisions where, some people weren't entirely comfortable with it, but a large number of our competitors were engaged in that conduct. And that was a factor in a decision that said we will do that. And I've also been involved in decisions where, no, we're not comfortable doing that. We're going to acknowledge that our competitor is doing that. We don't think that's right. And we're going to step back and consider options of what could we do. Maybe we need to alert the regulator. Maybe we need to complain to our competitor or the trade association about, what are you doing? We don't think that's consistent with, whatever regulations or ethical codes or other things are going on. So that's kind of conversation I've been in many times.
I mean, and you kind of are speaking to like what I just love about this industry. Like, it's so complex. There's so much opportunity in it. There's so many of these tough questions that, I mean, we're not playing checkers here. Like, this is absolutely a chess game. All those considerations you just said about contacting a regulator or complaining to the Trade Commission, these are strategic moves that a company needs to do in order to, not fall into this sort of unethical trap or not kind of put themselves at undue risk. It's so fascinating, and it's so interesting to learn. In my case, I get to have all these conversations with all these people like you in all these different industries, and you can see how these compliance and ethics muscles manifest themselves, based on the different dynamics and the different challenges that different industries pose. It's so cool. Yeah. So with all this experience, if you were coming into a program that was maybe existing, or maybe you're coming into a company that doesn't have a program at all, like, what do you think some of the foundational elements or the foundational building blocks are for building a compliance function that is both kind of like anti-fragile and sustainable? Yeah.
No, and I've had the opportunity to do that, and it's great fun to come in and design a brand new program, and I've also enhanced existing programs, so I can speak from both lenses. You mentioned tone at the top before, and that's one of the first things that before designing a new program is to make sure not just the CEO but the senior leadership, the board of directors, that they are all supportive of the direction you want to go. Because what will make your program very fragile is you can build a beautiful ethics and compliance program with all the right things. And if the CEO and the leadership and the board are not 100% behind it and aligned with your vision, right? You know the answer. Everybody does that'll be listening to this. So that can't be the answer. So you need to make sure you're aligned with senior management and even the board as you design it. The nuts and bolts, I think, are classic. You have to have the right code of conduct. You have to have the right set of policies. Then you have to have training so that people actually know what those mean. You have to have annual refreshes. It's not enough to read the code of conduct once and then work at a company for 10 years and never reread it. We all forget things as human beings. So you have to come back to it. You have to train on it and do that. And then, other core things in compliance as most people know is, what kind of monitoring and auditing are you going to do to make sure that people are following through. So I think those are the core elements. It's also, I think, just at a simplistic level, it's important to talk about your program, and the CEO needs to talk about the importance of it and why we care about running our business and why they care personally about running our business in an ethical manner. Because otherwise, it's just a policy that people read once a year and put on a shelf. That's not a real compliance program. I would pause there, but I think those are, top of mind things that I use, kind of the core principles to build out compliance department.
Have you experienced something like this where maybe it's a first time program and like leadership is like, we got to get a compliance program going here. I've just heard stories like this where then the person comes in and they're like, okay, I'm going to roll my sleeves up and I'm going to put a program in here. And then they end up getting this resistance from like leadership where they're like, whoa. I didn't think it was going to be all that. It's like when you get a trainer and they're like, all right, run those hills. And you're like, I didn't know I was going to be running hills. I thought we were going to be just, on the treadmill or something, right? Have you experienced something like that? And if you have or haven't, what advice would you give somebody who's kind of got the mandate? They were invited into the party, but now it feels like someone doesn't want them there,
Yeah, no, and that's always a challenge, whether it's an existing or a new program. And again, I think it really comes back to making sure, to the extent you can, that there's alignment between, what is our philosophy going to be? What are our core values of our organization? And are we aligned and are we accepting of that? And then you need to take that and bring it into the compliance program. But one of the things that I really believe in, and some people will doubt this, but I really do think that compliance can help the business achieve its objectives and its goals. And that's slightly different than I think what some compliance professionals would say. It's a little bit like is the glass half empty or is it half full? Am I looking at this issue that's been presented to the compliance and legal department as, what can we do such that the business can still go achieve what they want to achieve? Or am I just going to give the advice, no, you can't do what you want to do because that's against compliance policy, and I walk away? And again, I think and some legal departments are guilty of that kind of behavior as well. That's not solving the problem. That's not helping the business advance where they're trying to get to. And that's why I counsel, young lawyers, and I do want to talk about a course that I teach at the University of Colorado Law School that very much, talks about this, is before you start giving advice, because again, back to the business is in a hurry. Give me an answer right now. They sometimes won't even explain. My first question is always, what do you want to achieve, business? Help me understand before you demand that I give you advice in 30 seconds. What's the ultimate goal? What are you trying to achieve? You're telling me there's only one way to do it. And in my experience of 30 plus years, it's very rare. There's only one possible way to achieve your objective. But the business often will assume that. And they just want to know, can you bless this from a compliance standpoint or not? And I really counsel my young lawyers and young compliance professionals, don't get pulled into that trap. Force the business to explain to you, I need to understand what you're trying to achieve first. What's the goal? What's the objective? Where are you trying to go? And then let's come at it from how do we solve this? Can I give you alternatives? And some of those alternatives may be less risky from a legal or compliance standpoint, but I can't do that if you demand that I give you advice with your 30-second walk to the coffee station explanation, which happens a lot. And I say, and it's hard. And the CEO is like, I need an answer right now. I got to call the board in 5 minutes. And I'm like, you need to take a breath and give me 2 minutes of explanation, and then I will give you advice. But that's a very hard skill. It really is a hard thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, that's great advice. Why is it great advice, and why is that a hard skill, do you think?
Just because I think we run into a lot. The business is always in a hurry. They want to check the box. I've already decided the best way to achieve my objective, and I should have involved the compliance department. We're running fast. We didn't do it because I also like to really get compliance involved early in the planning process. You have this project, you have this thing to do. Get compliance involved early so they can be proactive and they can give you 3 potential paths to explore, not just one. There's almost always different ways to get to the same destination. It's rare there's only one road, one path to achieve it, but the business often gets locked into that. Well, our competitor is doing it this way. They're going down this path. I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting information, but are you 100% certain that's the only way to get to the same destination? I doubt it. And we need to have that conversation. And we may be able to work together and find you an option that has less risk from a compliance point of view that may ultimately be more successful. We don't know. You have to slow down and involve us early in the process so we can have that discussion and explore that together. Sounds easy. It's hard because the business is running fast. They don't want to spend the time. They know they want to do it in a compliant way. But again, huge time pressure. Our competitors are already out there doing this. Why are you giving me a hard time? Because our competitors are already out. They've been doing it for 2 weeks. We just found out. We have to launch it next Monday. Okay, everyone take a breath. We're going to help you get to where you want to go, but we need to back things up and have a bigger discussion than us putting holy water on what the competitor is doing as being okay. I don't have enough information.
Yeah. You don't have enough information. How could you give good advice if you don't have the context? It's like going to a doctor and saying, I have a headache. And they're like, all right, well, we got to get you into surgery. I mean, that's obviously crazy, right? Like they're going to ask a bunch of other questions to try to diagnose what it is so that they can give, good advice in this high stakes scenario. I think that takes a certain confidence to be able to say, hold on a second, and let me make sure that the advice I'm going to give you is good. Do you feel like that confidence just comes from your experience? Do you feel like it comes from, hey, this is just the right way to do it? Or does it come from like, listen, compliance, maybe it goes back to what you were saying before. Compliance can help us. Compliance is quality. Compliance can help us achieve our business results. And it's on me as the doctor in this example to like ask those right questions before I start prescribing things. Like, do you feel like it's that? And do you feel like the absence of this, telling someone to pause is rooted in kind of a lack of confidence in position and like value that we might provide to the company?
I think it is confidence, but the other thing that I will interject here, I think is really important, Nick, is that it's trust. And trust is built by that compliance person being extremely knowledgeable about the business. If they have been in all the planning meetings for this particular project, such that they know all of that, the business doesn't have to slow down and explain all this. We've already proactively given you that advice, and we're not making a rush decision. So again, I really like my compliance professionals and lawyers to be very embedded in the business. And by that, I mean, I want them in the key planning meetings. I want them in the strategy discussions of where the business is, what are the challenges, where are we trying to go? Because again, if we tell the business much earlier in that process, well, that's going to be very high risk if you try and achieve your objective in this way. Let's talk about alternatives. We didn't say no. We didn't say you can't do that, but we are alerting you that is a very high risk way to achieve your objective. We're early in the process. We have time. Let's describe the alternatives and different ways to do it and the pros and cons. And, we'll factor in what our competitors are doing and what's going on. But that to me is really important because if you have that background, you have that trust, it makes it much easier to then push back even on a CEO and say, hey, it's going to take more than 90 seconds to come to a good conclusion on what is a very important decision. I get it. We're not going to take 2 weeks, but we're going to have to take the time it takes to make sure we have all the information so that we can give you good advice.
It's so interesting, right? Like so much of so much of the proof of our efficacy shows up in trust, right? Like people trust the organization more. They trust that the company's deeds follow its words. They trust that their the managers are living out the company's values, right? So that's like the proof of it. And like for us to do our job, we have to build that trust to your exact point. We have to build these relationships and we have to embed ourselves in the business and be a part of the business instead of being apart from the business. And yet it seems like such a hard thing. Like what you just said makes a ton of sense, resonates deeply with me. And yet I find that a lot of people who are struggling with their programs to get that engagement or get that, get invited into those planning meetings, that's really what they're lacking. They're lacking those kind of like lines of trust with these other counterparts in other departments. So if somebody is fine, maybe they've been in a company for 3 years or 5 years or something, and they feel like, man, I don't have these trust bridges that I need in order to like really do my job as, and be as impactful as I think I could be. How do they go about doing that? Yeah. Or how, when you come into a company, you seem to acclimate to that. How do you start to build those rope bridges, out of the gate?
Yeah, great question. You really have to find champions, that are to help do that. In my role as chief legal officer, I can, gently, sometimes not gently, really insist that compliance professional is part of the planning process, because the business oftentimes will go through the whole planning process, completely forget about compliance, and then they just want to check the box exercise at the end. That's the exact wrong way to do what we've been talking about. But that's unfortunately what happens a lot. Again, if you build trust, you get those compliance professionals in the room where they're putting alternatives on the table. It's clear they're looking at this compliance issue from the perspective of the business because they deeply understand the business. They've been in part of the planning meetings and even the staff meetings talking about the challenges, et cetera. They're going to have a lot more trust, and they're going to be consulted earlier in the process, which is what we want. When we get ourselves in trouble is at the end, or God help us, sometimes even the decision's been made, we're implementing, and they're like, oops, we forgot to ask compliance. And compliance is like, whoa, what are you doing? No, you absolutely can't do it that way. Then, we have a huge issue, right? Then everybody's up in arms, and the CEO's like, why is this project on hold? As opposed to compliance being there from the very beginning, calmly, collectively asking the right questions, guiding the business. Sounds easy, it isn't. So you got to find champions within the organization who agree that legal and compliance people need to be involved early in the process, just like the quality people. A great analogy that you provided. Early in the process is just so much more effective, but it's not easy. And it does take senior leaders pushing for that. It does take enlightened business people to say, I don't want that 1 minute before I push the execute button. So I am going to get the compliance person involved earlier on. That's better for me. It's better for the business, but it also requires a certain mindset of that compliance professional. If they just sit there and reject every idea the business has to achieve, they're not going to get invited back to the meeting, right? So it has to be I have to lean in and try and help the business achieve its goals in a compliant way, but I have to be solution oriented, not, as I sometimes say, no oriented. Anybody can say, no, you can't do that. It's much harder to say, yes, what about this? We could do this. What about this? And get the business engaged. Oh, okay. Well, I don't love that. It's not what I wanted to do, but let's talk about that idea and maybe we can make that work. That's a mindset of the compliance professional. And, I mentioned, just very briefly, want to give a plug for a great program at the University of Colorado where you can get an ethics and compliance master's that's granted by the law school, funded by the Daniels Fund. And these are all the principles we're talking about today are very much things that we try and embed. It's my way of giving back with a colleague who is a full-time compliance professional to, these are largely people who are already in compliance roles and they want to get a master's. So they come back and in very hands-on practical way do that. But all of these principles sound easy. And honestly, as you probably appreciate, Nick, and some of our listeners will, they're not easy. You have to find internal champions. You have to have the right mindset, as I've mentioned, right? Are you leaning in to solve the problem, or are you going to be viewed as an obstacle? Because if you're an obstacle, you're not going to get invited to the planning part.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it takes a certain flexibility. Like every other department has this wild amount of flexibility where they're trying to get over, around, under, through whatever impediment is in their way. And we have to kind of mimic that body language. We have to mimic that flexibility. And, it's such a low level kind of approach to compliance to just say no to everything. It's like, well, I did my job. There's no risk. There's no risk. Exactly. We're not doing anything. Everybody's just laying on the floor here. You know what I mean? And it seems like in every field, expertise is highly correlated with knowing what matters and what doesn't matter. And again, when you're a first-time auditor, you're going to check every single freaking account, right? But then as you get better, you're like, okay, well, the risk is really concentrated in these 5 areas. And I really need to bottom it out in these 5 areas. And these other areas really have an immaterial risk. And when you deal with, the latter type of auditor versus the former, it's a totally different experience. The latter really seems like somebody who understands a business. So, and I think our ability or our, to your point, we have to have that kind of mindset to solve for outcome, because everybody else in the business is solving for outcome. And like the outcome is the mission. So like, how do we, this sort of collective, this voluntary collective of people that show up to kind of do a bunch of activities and processes in pursuit of some mission, how do we achieve that in a more, in a lower risk kind of a way? We have to keep our eyes on that, and we have to be, if we're on a team of athletes, we have to be an athlete as well if we're going to go ahead and wear that jersey. And so I just think that intentionality of solving for outcome, the intentionality, it takes that intentionality to see around the curve and say, hey, I have to do that work now. I have to start making some deposits into the relationship banks of all these other, all these other counterparts within the organization, because there's going to be a point in time down the road where there is a project or there is something that I'm brought in late on, and I need to have their ear if I'm going to be able to like do my job. Not easy at all, but man, how cool is it to be at the kind of cutting edge of this industry? I mean, people are coming back to get their masters. I mean, 50 years ago, 30 years ago, these programs didn't even exist. And so like, it seems like we're stepping into this new era. There's more and more of these kinds of conversations being had, across the world. And I think it's going to really drive some real change in how we as compliance and ethics and legal professionals interact with the business to really drive, I just think over the next 5 or 6 years, maybe 10 years, the extent to which we can do our job in a more meaningful way is going to translate into like a separation between the organizations that actually care about doing the right thing and those who just kind of pay lip service to it. And I think it's going to translate into, we will be able to see very quickly those most ethical companies. It'll be a separator. And we've already started to see it a little bit. Like after COVID, we started to see it. And through all these other changes that have come through our industry. We spent a little time here talking about trust, and I'm always kind of interested in this this conflict, I guess, or this kind of contrast. How do you go about balancing like a culture of compliance or a culture of trust with like enforcement? You know what I'm saying? Because the enforcement is like, if your kids are always in trouble, then they're probably not going to come to you with stuff, right? Because they don't want to get in trouble, right? We all have that self-preservation thing. So there have to be consequences, but also I want my kids to come to me. So how do you balance that in the context of our role,
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's very challenging in compliance, right? And I'll use the self-disclosure. Somebody comes to you and says, hey, we made a mistake. We recognize it. We know that it's contrary to the code of conduct or other policies, and now we have to deal with it, right? So certainly you acknowledge, in my opinion, and you take, you take into account that this employee is bringing this forward, they're self-reporting, as opposed to the employee who intentionally knows that they're doing something counter to a policy or the code of conduct, and, they don't come forward, right? So that's one example. I think the other thing you have to be very, open and transparent about is, what does the compliance group do? We're going to try and help the business we're going to be as proactive as possible and try and prevent as many of these kind of issues as we can. But recognizing if there are violations of the code of conduct and policies, we're very transparent in the organization. That can lead, up to some type of discipline, up to termination of your employment. It's right in the code of conduct where I'm currently employed, and it usually is. So you can't hide from that. But certainly, if a compliance department is running well, in my opinion, and so, back to my example, an employee comes forward and said, hey, I really messed up. I've been submitting my expense reports incorrectly, and I've been getting reimbursed for this. Now I realize I shouldn't. I want to pay the company back. I did not realize it. I knew it. That's relatively, easy to deal with. You're probably not going to have a lot of discipline. They're going to pay the company back. They self-reported. That's pretty easy. But I think the step sometimes people miss is, but that's a great learning opportunity, right? We want to take that self-disclosure and train, right? And educate people and say, hey, we had an employee come forward. She didn't understand she was doing this wrong. kudos to them. They self-reported. They're still employed. There's, it's going to be, they're going to get a written warning that don't do that again in their file without disclosing who it is, but train the rest of the employee base so that you don't have a repeat of that. So you don't have to you find that person who didn't self-report, was hiding it, and you have to terminate that person. That may happen anyway. But again, that, being as, upfront so you can be, proactive. We talked about education and awareness. But also when you find things like this and maybe the policy's not clear, maybe we need to go out, in addition to educating people about this situation, we're also letting you know we're going to amend the policy to make it very clear. You can't do this. You can't seek reimbursement for this particular issue. But, at the end of the day, it is difficult that, the compliance department can and does have to, part of our job is to recommend discipline that sometimes is termination. Now, ultimately, the manager in most companies make that ultimate decision. But, I've been in lots of situations where it's just unavoidable that we have to recommend that employee is terminated. But again, if that's where we go, then we want to do as much as we can from revising policies, educating, awareness, so we don't have a repeat of that. We don't want to be an enforcement agency any more than we have to, but we also can't run away from it because sometimes we have to.
Yeah, sometimes we have to. And I think, I love that example of kind of broadcasting. And again, you could keep that person's, information confidential, but broadcasting and using this as an example to say, look how reasonable we are. There's this concept of survivorship bias, right? Where we disproportionately weigh those I want to start a restaurant because you see all these restaurants around not knowing that 9 out of 10 fail in the first 8 months or something, right? That, right? That survivorship bias that generates a behavior. Yeah. We can create that same survivorship bias within our company by holding up those stories and showing look, this is the system working. This person is still employed and it's all good. And I think, our negativity bias as human beings causes us, coupled with our self-preservation, wiring, causes us, if we're not sure about something, we're probably going to kind of take the more conservative, from our perspective, the more conservative approach, which is probably not raising your hand and saying, hey, I screwed something up. But if they can see that, hey, this rope bridge isn't going to break, I'm not going to fall to my death into this, abyss of the unknown, well, then you're going to get some more of that engagement. And as you start to see more people around you doing it, well, now your norms start to change. And now your culture, cultures change little by little, then all at once. And it's just the stacking up of these little interactions and these data points that can really be meaningful. We are right at the end here, Kurt. This was phenomenal. I'd love for you to share where people can find out some more about the course that you teach and the program that you're a part of at the University of Colorado, and just how else people can find you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm on LinkedIn. You'd find me under Curtis Oltmans, and I would recommend that the listeners go take a look at the Daniels Fund. Bill Daniels was a business leader who, way ahead of his time, 25 years ago, he gave away his $1 billion estate to found the Daniels Fund. Wow. And it's given an unbelievable amount of scholarships and other things. At the moment, it's funding ethics and compliance programs at 9 different business and law schools in Western states. The one at the University of Colorado is 10 years old. There's usually only about 15 students per year in this program, and I teach a class on how to conduct a compliance investigation. Law students take it as well. But really great. Mr. Daniels was the owner of the Lakers and Utah Star. Great story. We don't have time to go into it here, but definitely take a look at the Daniels Fund and see what he did. Really an incredible business person who always ran and did things in an ethical way. And he thought that was a competitive advantage 25 years ago, way ahead of his time.
Yeah, real forward thinker. That's phenomenal. So we'll check that out. Thank you so much, Kurt. This was phenomenal. See you next time.
Thanks. Take care. Bye, Nick.